For the
Um,
record, I would go to that class if it wasn't on the same night as the Daniel Matlin.
oh no. Well, honestly, fair enough. That is a fair choice to
Yeah,
pick
if
it.
you're gonna lose to somebody.
Yeah. Okay. So I think this is what did it. All right. So hi everybody. Good evening. This is the class for Parshat Toldot. The motivating question that is going to animate this learning session is, I don't know why is the dog showing up? Does everyone see the dog? I guess I just see the dog. Um, so yeah, so the motivating question is that basically one of the really interesting things about the Talmud is that it, I think, preserves a certain kind of complexity that doesn't end up playing out, especially as the tradition develops. And all the more so the actual Torah, right? The Torah has, I think, we have like the main characters of the Torah who end up becoming the ancestors of the Jewish people. And then there's a bunch of side characters that end up falling away. The brothers that kind of go bad or what have you. So there's Ishmael, who's brothers with Yitzchak, and there's Esau, who's brothers with Yaakov. That all ends up climaxing in a way with the stories around Jacob's sons, the 12 tribes, in which there's an internecine conflict between Joseph and the rest of the sons. But unlike the case with Yishmael and Yitzchak, no one's expelled. Everyone stays whole in the family. And that actually ends up kind of setting the path that there's not that sense of a splitting family tree, that we found the family like root and we're going to follow that trunk all the way to the leaves. That metaphor extended. But the question, in a sense, that we're left with is, how do we relate to our cousins, right? How do we relate with the parts of our family that we're connected to, but on the other hand, end up taking a different path? The most intense version of this is that they, especially Esau, ends up becoming a prototypical figure that represents not just someone we have discomfort with, but actually an enemy, or someone who is oppressing us. Because Esau, which is also called Edom, and the red color of Edom is relevant. The red color of Edom, because he's called Edom because he asks for the red lentil stew, and the Bible says, and that's why he's called red guy. That's why he's called Edom. Associated with the Edomites, right? The tribe, or the people, the ancient people. The red color, though, is associated also with Rome, and Esau, Edom, ends up becoming identified with Rome and also then with Christendom. So Esau ends up becoming identified with the main kind of like agent of oppression in medieval Jewish history, especially. And the question we're left with, in a sense, is that the right way to deal with people or family members that have become a grit, right? Have become some source of discomfort for us, to kind of like turn it into a binary of like, we're the good guys, they're the bad guys? Or is preserved in the tradition more of the complexity that we saw in the original text in the Torah, and even in the rabbinic period as well? That's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at, can we evince sympathy for the devil, right? Does the Midrash, does the Talmud, and then finally in the Zohar, is there some evidence of that originary connection that we have, and thus that still sense of our concern for Esau's well-being? Or are we satisfied with kind of like shunting Esau into the role of enemy or of oppressor? And I think we're going to explore that very interesting complexity here. So I'm going to share a screen. It's not showing up. Okay, share screen. There we go. All right, great. Can everyone see that? Oh, I know why. I think I spotlit. Jesse instead of me. I think that's what happened. Great. So you all got. I think I got to see the face of the family dog, Jesse, who is the sweetest, cutest thing in the entire world. Okay, so let's look at the first, the germ verse. So this is, again, setting the scene. Jacob and Esau have a conflict. Jacob is the favorite son of his mother, and Esau is the favorite son of his father. And Esau has the right to the birthright because he was the firstborn. Now, they were twins, so they were in the womb together, and it seems like they were struggling in the womb, mythically. But Esau is born first, and Jacob is called Jacob because he's holding Esau's heel as they're born, right? And Akev is the word for heel, so because he's holding onto the heel, he gets known as Yaakov. And we'll look actually another play on the words of Yaakov later, because what else that root can mean. Jacob ends up, with the help of his mother, kind of positioning himself using trickery to appropriate the firstborn blessing from his father. But before that had all happened, before the trickster Jacob emerged, Jacob had some kind of legal claim to it, because after Esau comes home hungry from a hunt, right? Esau is like the big, burly, hairy guy, and Esau is like the pale, hairless, nerd. Jacob's been cooking, and he has a bowl of lentil stew, and Esau rashly bargains away his rights to the birthright for a bowl of soup. And that shows maybe Esau, like his character, he doesn't have a very strong character. He's not very like patient or wise person. Point is, though, is the question in a way is also, is that actually a legally binding sale, right? Can you actually sell something like a birthright? If you say, I bet you $1 zillion that you won't make this basketball shot, that's not actually a legally binding contract, right? No one's going to take you seriously. So Jacob still has to use his trickery to steal away the birthright from his brother by dressing up like Esau, putting hair on his arms. Isaac famously says, the voice is like Jacob's, but the hands are the hands of Esau, because Isaac's eyes are failing, so he can't tell who's who. Taking advantage of his old ailing father, Jacob is a complex character who clearly grows into his role as patriarch as he progresses in life. But the results of Jacob's angling for the birthright is that Esau is left destitute, and not just like deprived, but actually like crushed. And the fact that the Torah shows this ends up becoming a grit in the rabbinic maw that I think ends up becoming a very interesting opportunity for developing a more complex relationship with Esau, and even with the cousin of Christendom, as we'll see later. Okay, so the verse is this. Esau said to his father, have you but one blessing, father? Bless me too, dad. And Esau wept aloud. Now, interesting here, again, besides the fact that the Torah is spending like time and real estate giving space for the bad guy to have feelings, is that the Torah doesn't usually use emotional language. It usually doesn't kind of make those things explicit. But here it's actually, the Torah is being quite clear that Esau is having an emotional reaction of feeling distraught. So what the rabbis are left with is, in a sense, again, how do we deal with this? So let's look at kind of one of the earlier texts that I was able to find on this question, and we'll see kind of what character that the rabbis start to relate to. So the sages taught in a Braita. A Braita is a rabbinic tradition that wasn't codified in the Mishnah or in the Midrash. 3 came with a demand, and these are they: Cain, Esau, and Menashe. Now, Cain, right, we know him, first murderer in human history. Not a good guy to be grouped with. Manasseh, maybe a little bit less famous, is famous to the rabbis for being the bad king. He was the king in Israel who was idolatrous. He was a wicked guy full of bad traits. So the rabbis are starting to group Esau, who hasn't done anything bad, keep in mind, all right, with people who have textual evidence of having done bad things. So already we start to see the way in which the rabbis kind of like the way the Midrash tends to work. It tends to divide people: good, bad, dark, light, etc. But interestingly, I think kind of flip it on its other side, even though the rabbis are seeing Esau with suspicion or with a critical relationship, grouping him with these bad guys, they're still willing to give all 3 of them a chance to actually make their claim. The Talmud is willing to give space for them to be set to say like, hey, what about my rights? What about my feelings? So I'll start with Cain's claim is this. He says, my sin is too great to bear. Right? That's a quote from Breshit in the Cain and Abel story. Cain said before God, Master of the universe, is my transgression greater than the transgression of the 600,000 Jews who are destined to sin before you with the golden calf, and you forgive them? Parenthetically, and you can't forgive me? What's interesting about this is that Cain is making a logical claim. He's saying, why am I so bad? Why am I so bad when it is endemic to the relationship between you and the people of Israel that they screw up all the time? Why can't I be shown the same mercy and compassion and patience? Now, you can like treat it as him playing games, him turning God against him, against God's self. You might not see this as a sincere claim, but it's not a totally absurd claim that Cain is making. You can understand it. Cain's saying, listen, I did something bad. They did something bad. I killed a guy. Yes, it's very bad. They end up turning the entire Mount Sinai experience into a pagan festival of idolatry. We all screw up. Can't you cut me some slack? Okay. I mean, again, your mileage may vary. You might take that seriously. You might see him as trying to take advantage. Here comes Esau's claim. Esau came with a claim, as it is stated, have you but one blessing, my father? And that's all the rabbis give us. I didn't add the Menashe claim. The Menashe claim is like clear that he's not being honest. It's not a serious claim. Esau's claim, though, is just him quoting the Torah. And the fact that both him and Cain are quoting the Torah, first of all, puts them in the rabbinic conversation. Fine, that's the way the rabbis work. Everyone's a rabbi to the rabbis. But Esau's claim in his quote is, have you only one blessing, my father? What's he really asking? It's a real question. What do you think he's really asking? Like, what's his taina, right? What's his like objection?
Is your compassion limited to only one thing at a time? You can only bless one person, but not another?
Mm-hmm. Great. Okay. Why is there a limit on your love? Yeah, Mom?
Can you undo and give me the birthright? Because it really should belong to me.
Okay. So Shosh was saying, and since it's like kind of an emotional claim, namely like the thing about love is that it's not like a quantitative thing, right? Can't you be kind to me as well? And you're saying, no, it's actually a legal claim. He's saying, listen, actually, you giving the birthright to Jacob was illegitimate. It's not like, have you only one, like you only have one blessing and you did it wrong, Dad, right? You actually gave it to the wrong guy and I deserve it. Great. Both definitely feasible readings. Anyone else? Okay. So again, I think like if there's only one meta takeaway, like the fact that the rabbis just let the Esau's words stand on their own without qualifying them, I find actually quite striking. And two, is that they're willing to give him space to make his case. So already we see, even though to the rabbis, right, they already start to like lump Esau in as a bad guy, and because of that, he ends up being like a cosmic enemy of sorts. But still, he doesn't stop being human, right? We still have some sense of his humanity that's preserved, that he gets to have his, he gets to make his claim to, he gets to try to defend his stake. Okay. So here is a later text from the Shlah HaKodesh. The Shlah is Yeshayahu Horowitz, 16th century rabbi, Kabbalist, big macher in Bohemia, in Prague. The Shlah, which is short for the Shnei Luchot HaBrit, is this cholent of a book. It's just delightful. It's just like all kinds of things are inside of it. You really can't even like organize it. And he has stuff on the Torah, Talmud, he's stuff on the Torah, he's got stuff on ritual, So this is from his Perush on the Torah, it's from his commentary on the Torah. He says, commenting on Esau, asking, you have only a single blessing. He actually ends up reading it kind of like Ellen, namely, you have a single blessing. You only do have one blessing. says Esau. He says, and since there is only that one blessing, all ancillary elements follow the core item. That doesn't make sense. I'll explain it in a second. So if I'm always going to follow after Jacob, why can't you bless me too, Father? Extend to me his blessing. Okay, so first, to understand this, we actually have to understand a little bit of halacha, Jewish law. So it says, Me'achar shekol baracha ki hatafel nigrar achar ha'ikar. The tuffle follows the ikar, as they would say in the yeshiva. Now, when you make a blessing on like bread, no, bread's too hard. If you make a blessing on herring on a cracker, okay? Herring on a cracker. What blessing do you say? Again, real question. What blessing do you say? Herring on a cracker.
Mizunot.
Okay, why mizunot?
Because the mizunot, I don't know which Hebrew word it is, it takes precedence over the other.
Okay. Okay, because mizunot is a more...
It's a higher, I don't know exactly the word, but it's like hamotzi bread is like the highest.
It's the ikar.
People bless it, yeah. And then mizunot, or, you know, the fruits that grow in the land of Israel. And then you got anything that would be a shehakol is subsidiary to the mizunot and hamotzi and all that.
Okay, good. So there's a hierarchy of food stuff, right? Bread, because it's like the staple of human civilization. Ikar means the essence, right? It's the essence of human civilization. When humans learn how to make bread, that's them using technology, fire, right, to transform raw materials into something that sustains us. It's them transforming nature into culture. Bread is incredible. I'm not just saying this because I got really into baking bread during quarantine. Halacha agrees with you, right? Bread, whatever you're having with bread, you always say amotzi. That's true. And other things made with wheat, like mizonos, right, or barley or what have you, are the second rung. And then under that, vegetables and da-da-da, right? Except, here we have a little bit of complexity. Okay, so you say mizonos. Good. Any other answers? Herring on a cracker. What do you say? Come on, people. Take a risk. Unless you disagree. You agree. Crackers rule. Crackers are like, crackers rule. Okay, so here I'm going to introduce the terms of ikar and tafel, right? Ikar and tafel. You say the blessing on the essential item in a combination. So the combination here is herring plus cracker. You're eating the herring. The cracker is the vehicle. Because you're eating the herring, you say shehakol on that combination. Now, some people would agree with Rick that because like there is a strict hierarchy and it's about the object, it's not about the experience. But there's also a very strong position about the fact that you say the blessing on the thing that you're focused on. The thing you're focused on is the herring, right? You're not eating the cracker and you're using the herring so that you can eat the cracker. You're eating the cracker so you can eat the herring. It's a teleology of blessings, okay? And because you're doing it for the purpose of eating the herring gets the blessing. Okay, that's ikar. So what the Shlah has done is used hilchos barachos. He's used the laws of like blessing food to understand blessing your children. And he says, fine, there's a ta'aroves of kids. There's like a mixture of kids. And you can only do one blessing. And it goes after the ikar. And the tofel follows after the ikar. And here's something that's kind of sad. And he says, I recognize in terms of the direction of the people of Israel, I mean, named after my brother, Jacob, Israel, this family story, I'm getting second billing, right? Jacob has top billing. I recognize that. But because he has top billing, Dad, can't you then connect me to his blessing? Can't you extend to me his blessing? Because when you make the blessing on the ikar, the tofel is included too. When you make the blessing on the primary item in the mixture, the secondary item also gets the blessing. You get to eat the cracker because you made a blessing on the herring. What I find in this quite striking to me is that I think Esau, through the reading of the Shlah, is resisting the rabbis. The rabbis are starting to say Esau is part of the a branch of the family that we're not going to talk to anymore. They're the bad part of the family. We don't have a connection with them anymore. Esau is in the telling of the Shlah is saying, no, 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 no. I lose. I get it. I lose. I'm sad about that, but I still want to be part of the family. Don't kick me out. I think it's something like unconscious happening in the Shlah, in a sense of noting the connection between the brothers that can't be lost, and even willing to extend to Esau the charitable reading in which he's saying, I want to get back on board with this family. I recognize, in a sense, like it's your story and I'm part of it. And I'm, in a sense, I'd rather be part of your story than not part of your story. And the Shlah, again, gives Esau, his imagined Esau, that chance. Okay.
Question.
Thoughts? Mm-hmm.
Was Isaac privy to the knowledge when God spoke to Rebekah about what Jacob's role would be when she was pregnant?
I'm sorry, can you say it again?
Did Isaac know about what God said to Rebekah about Jacob's role? Wasn't it when she was still pregnant?
About Rebekah's role with Jacob?
No, when God told Rebekah that Jacob was going to be the one to be the leader.
Oh, no. All this is private. No, Yitzchak wasn't privy to that.
Okay.
I mean, it's very interesting. Yitzchak is a very private guy. He's not like boldly out there like his dad was. He's like, more of a quiet indoor kid. And also, again, like I think his failing faculties kept him from being able to manifest himself in that same kind of way. Okay, maybe it's a little bit smaller. Okay, so I'm going to bring us to another Midrash. So this is from a text called Tanchuma, which is a later Midrashic collection edited in Babylonia, actually one of the few Midrash collections actually edited in Babylonia. And this is from a different edition. So there's a collection called Tanchuma Yilamdenu, and this is from an edition by Shlomo Buber, not Martin Buber, his grandfather though, very interestingly. And Shlomo Buber edited this collection, actually a zillion other Midrashic collections. A really incredible kind of like proto-Jewish studies type scholar, but also like a rabbi. And in it, what we have is, the Tanchuma Midrashim are much more colorful and much more even like flamboyant than the classical Midrashim from the rabbinic period. There is a really wonderful book by my friend Dov Weiss about how Tanchuma Midrash ends up taking these moments of incipient conflict between God and Israel. And in Tanchuma, it turns the volume up to 11, in which Israel is like, it feels empowered enough to throw it back in God's face. So there's much more boldness, bold choices, risks being taken in what it means to kind of be a co-participant in telling the story of the Torah that Midrash entails, right? Midrash is like fitting in new information in the gaps in the text. And with Tanchuma, we see especially some more bold and flamboyant choices being made. Chutzpah is a great word for that, Katerina. Exactly. It's much more of a chutzpahdik book. Wonderful choice. Okay, so here we have Esau again, and this is a complaint that the Torah records, right? Haven't you saved me a blessing, right? Isn't there a blessing left over for me? He begs of his father. Reish Lakish, Talmudic rabbi, but again, this is like unclear like how authentic this tradition is, but whatever. Reish Lakish said, this is one of the three children of Adam. And by children of Adam, he really just means human beings, right? This is one of the three people who came with a legal circumvention against God, right? See the Talmud above, right? We saw Esau bring his claim against God. And remember, Tanchuma is where these types of stories end up flourishing. Esau brings his complaint against God. Esau said to him, if we are both righteous, doesn't your God have enough blessings for both of us? Now, what's the switch that just happened, right? Shosh, let's go back to your claim, right? Before when it said, don't you have another blessing for me? You said, is your love, Father, without bounds? Don't you have room in your heart for me too? What has Esau just done here, though? What's the slide he just accomplished? Right, he's shifting his complaint against being his father, saying, hey, Dad, don't you have another blessing for me, to the source of blessing. He's bringing his complaint right to God. Hey, God, you source of all blessing. You have nothing containing you. You have nothing constraining you. What's keeping you from blessing me too? Why can't I get my fair shake? The Holy One replied, shut up. Literally, close your mouth. Look, look, it's actually literally right there. It says, look, Jacob is blessing the 12 tribes, and he does not bless any of them the same. So that's the consolation that God is offering Esau. It's offered sharply, but that's maybe just the way that the ancient world worked. It said, look at your brother, who at the end of his life, right, in the future, will be blessing his children when he's dying, right? Your father's dying, he's giving you guys blessings. And when he dies, he'll be giving his sons blessings too. And look at the way he does it. Famously, right, in the scene in Vayechi, at the end of the book of Breshit, we have Jacob giving tailor-made blessings to each of his kids, which then end up kind of defining what the nature of the tribe is. So what's the implied claim that God is making? God is saying, look, Jacob got a special blessing from your father, and you will get your own blessing as well that's appropriate for you. So God's saying, look, it's fair. God's explaining it, justifying the choice that was made. And Esau, to be fair, does get a blessing, but it's definitely of a lower order than Jacob's was, because Jacob got the double blessing. Jacob got the abundance, whereas Esau gets the tofel, right? He gets the secondary cracker. He gets the dry tam-tam. But interestingly, so we have God justifying it, right? Which is, of course, what we know is the right way to respond to anyone coming with feelings of hurt, is to actually justify it to them and explain why their feelings are wrong. That was, again, trademark deadpan irony, right? You come from the Torah, but you get the irony. Interestingly, Yitzchak pushes back not on Esau, he pushes back on God. And Yitzchak says, Yitzchak is full of compassion. He's moved by his son's complaint. He's moved by his son's expression of hurt. So he starts to bless Esau too, but the Shekhinah departs from him. So we have God intervening actually to keep Yitzchak from compensating Esau with a fuller blessing. Fascinating. Right? I mean, again, I want us to look at the complexity of these texts, the multi-vocality of them, right? They're not, I think one of the things that really bums me out is that when I see lots of like adult ed Jewish classes, it kind of like just treats these Torahs as like sound bites, right? Like, you know, like the news, right? And it's like, okay, what's the chap, right? What is the one thing that this thing is saying? And that's the way it might work with like law, right? Law, you have like the bottom line, black letter law. But what makes Midrash, and I would even say even law, like Jewish law, is also very complex and very mature. What makes Midrash and Jewish Torah so incredible is that there's always multiple voices, even sometimes competing voices, happening in it at the same time. We have Yitzchak, right, our ancestor, who we are inspired by and we model ourselves after, moved by Esau's complaint. And in a sense, it's like through another trick that he doesn't end up being able to execute that feeling of mercy. Esau, I mean, the text is saying in a way, his claim is legitimate. Yitzchak started to respond to it, you know, with sympathy. But the text also needs to justify, but why don't we then have like, why aren't we part of the Esauites, right? Why aren't we Edomites? It still needs to make sure we maintain the family line that ends up continuing through Jacob. Okay. And then what happens? Yitzchak brings his own objection back to God. So God withdrew from Isaac, withdraws the power of blessing. Interestingly, also, actually in the Muslim world, there's a cognate word for the kind of charismatic power that like a mystic or an imam has. It's called barakah, right? And it's a cognate with the word bracha. But here I think we see actually the way in which the notion of bracha functions as this kind of like presence of God, right? It is like, bracha is not just like nice words you say to somebody. It is channeling the divine presence and then extending that divinity and that sense of abundance and well-being to somebody else, right? A blessing is a real thing that happens in the world. It's not just like a nice thought or sentiment. It's actually an extension of something divine to somebody else. Okay, there's something charismatic or pneumatic about it. It's a flow that you're extending to somebody. Okay. So he prays, but interestingly, what does he pray? He's praying against God. This is a fascinating example of like prayer isn't just like acquiescing to God's will or what have you, and just surrendering yourself, right? What you have is Yitzchak praying as a dialogue with God, bringing, in a sense, Esau's complaint back to God. He's picking up his son's complaint. He says, let the wicked be shown favor, right? And okay, so every quote you're going to see is all from the same verse, and it's the verse pinging, ponging back and forth. It says, let the wicked be shown favor. Fine, Esau's not a great guy. He sold his birthright. He's kind of a rough and tumble guy, but still, doesn't everyone deserve forgiveness? Doesn't everyone deserve mercy? God says back, continuing with the same verse, literally the words right after it, but he won't learn righteousness. Right, so the whole verse is that, like, let the wicked be shown favor, even though they won't know righteousness. But here we have the Midrash putting those two clauses in two different mouths. Yitzchak says, fine, he's a wicked guy. He's a rough and tumble guy, but he still deserves compassion. And then God says back, but he doesn't quite earn it because he doesn't earn righteousness. He says, do you desire to bless this one? Asks God. He's going to destroy my house and confuse stores and riches. And here we have again the filtering in that Esau isn't just a guy in the Torah anymore. Esau comes to represent Christianity. Now, the thing about Christianity is it has a famously complex relationship with Judaism. Why? We have the same book. We have the same primary stories. We have the same claims, right? We share a lot of themes. We share a lot. And not only that, but Christianity comes out of the ancient Israelite Jewish religion. Christianity makes a claim that they're the true Israel, that we did not pay attention to the covenant of spirit. We didn't pay attention to the final salvation of Christ. We're not Israel anymore. Christianity is actually the true Israel. We're carnal Israel, they're spiritual Israel. Right? That's the claim in early Christianity, all over. You see it in Augustine, especially, Origen, etc. So what we have is a rivalry between siblings. We have a rivalry between brothers. And I don't know if you know this, but also like, so Esau comes to represent Christianity, Ishmael comes to represent Islam. And you'll see like the different commentaries on the Torah end up filtering in people's feelings about those various religions, and you'll see the way that they treat these characters in the Torah. Esau tends to, because like Christianity has been a source of more conflict and even oppression with Jews, Esau tends to get trumpeted as then the real bad guy. Ishmael ends up kind of just being more of an ambivalent character. And you see that especially like in Rambam, right? Because Rambam's living in a Muslim world. So he doesn't like speak anything bad about Muslims or Ishmael. Because, you know, they're monotheists. They're fine, right? They actually believe in one God. Point being, though, Esau is not just Esau anymore, right? By the time the Talmud comes around, by the time the rabbinic movement comes around, Esau is identified with Rome, right? Source of oppression, religious persecution, and with Christianity, who are supersessionists trying to, in a sense, inherit the legacy from us. It's literally playing the story out again. Who gets the birthright? Jacob or Esau? Who gets to really claim to be God's people? Jews were Christians. And if you look around at the world, especially let's say in the earlier time periods, who would you say won? Who got the birthright? Us or them? Them, right? We're living in Christendom. We're living in a Christian country, right? Merry Christmas all over. COVID can't stop Christmas. We are a tiny minority living in a Christian dominant society. And the rabbis are trying to process that through this story, but process it through irony in a sense, because in the Torah, we get the birthright, but in the world, Esau got the birthright because Esau has hegemony, right? Christendom won, at least apparently. Christendom has political power. Literally Rome, the most powerful empire in the rabbinic period. Christianity won. What do you do with that? How do you reconcile being the chosen people with being a tiny, oppressed nation? How can those two things exist at the same time? And here we have the rabbis playing that out. He's going to destroy my house. Christianity is going to supplant us and take over the Torah. He's going to confuse stores and riches. He is going to create new ideas that end up infiltrating into the holy text. And thus it is stated in the land of integrity, often justly, Isaac says back, give to him this world, but he won't see the glory of God in the world to come. And that, in a sense, is the pshara. That's the reconciliation that the rabbis come to. Yes, in the political sphere, when it comes to achievement in this world, Esau won, fine. But what about the real source of value, the ikar, not the tafel, right? The ikar. The real primary source of value is the world to come. The real relationship with God is not something that's obvious, like having the most Facebook friends or the most Twitter followers or what have you. The real mark of quality isn't quantity, right? Quality isn't quantity. We have a special connection with God that can't be disproven no matter how bad it looks, right? All right, I just want to put a pin in that right there. Thoughts, questions, clarifications. Because I brought in this new element, Esau representing Rome/Christianity, but that is a really important aspect, especially to look at it as we end up looking at the later text that we'll be looking at. Like, I think that's really what's the primary element that's being dealt with here. But thoughts, objections, reflections?
Well, Esau's ascendancy is only due to our sins. You know, we would still be in the superior position had we not sinned and broke the covenant with Hashem. And
Okay.
I think it's mentioned somewhere in the Torah there that, you know, as Yaakov is fulfilling his role and responsibilities, you know, we'll be dominant. But if we don't, that's when Esau gets the power.
Okay.
But again, it's only temporary.
Wait, so does that mean that being oppressed is a byproduct of being sinful, and that's the sort of paradox between being the chosen people and being the oppressed? The
oppression is part of being the chosen people. I'm not going to speak. I'm not the rabbi, but from what I've learned, it works both ways. When you're the chosen people,
you get oppressed.
It's we have a responsibility, and we have the covenant with Hashem, right? And it's like,
right. This is the Torah of this is the Torah of numbers, right? Like, listen, the greater you are, the more haters you have.
It's like a double-edged sword. Like when, you know, because we have that response, you know, it's kind of like the Spider-Man thing. With greater responsibility or greater power comes greater responsibility. Like when you're using that power properly and responsibly, then you'll have all the blessings. When you're abusing that power, then you're going to suffer a worse fate. It's like we have an agreement with God, and he's not going to break his end of it. Like we have to live up to that. God's going to hold us to it. And it's like the oppression and the anti-Semitism, that's kind of like a mechanism to get us to keep up our end of the bargain. Like it's only when Jews are not fulfilling their role and serving Hashem properly, that's when you have all the anti-Semitism. When, you know, in the time of King David and King Solomon, before the kingdom fell apart, like Jews were like, had so much power and prosperity, right? It's only because of our continual ups that we, you know, and this is the mechanism through which God is going to reveal himself through the Jewish people. And what happens to the Jewish people when we do the eventual teshuvah and the exile's over and the redemption, that's part of the whole revelation of Hashem and his power is how the Jews, you know, they had a position of ascendancy and then they were oppressed, but then they came full circle and back to their rightful position again, because through Hashem's protection and providence.
But that very setup in a way seems very much like a hostage situation, and the role of free will in that setup seems very limited if that's how it's going to be conceptualized, right? Because then you don't really have free will. If you don't abide by this, then you will suffer and be oppressed, which is I know how
interesting. Okay.
Certain how it's been read in certain communities that the Holocaust was punishment for being too integrated into like German society, and so, you know,
right, ignoring though that the Jews who suffered the most in the Holocaust were Eastern Europeans, not Germans.
Right. Exactly.
The least assimilated, right? The most pious.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I want to jump back in, but first of all, this is fantastic because the real key to like a good class happening is not like, it's, you know, like imagine learning like a triangle, right? Like I'm here, you're here, and then you're here. Like the best learning isn't when like B goes to A and then A goes back to B and C goes to A and A goes back to C. It's actually when A, right, and then B and A, right, or get to talk to each other. Right? I'm glad you feel comfortable to have your own readings. It's very like, I'm not here to have the answers. I'm here to facilitate learning, right? But I do want to help kind of crystallize what I'm hearing though, because I want to put it in a constellation for us. So one thing I'm hearing from Rick is like let's call it a trial by fire model, right? In which actually suffering has a purpose. Suffering is to test and to refine us, is to purify us, is to help us kind of learn from it, to wring out the parts of us that need to get burned out in a sense. And also we are responsible in some ways for the state that we're in, because why are we a small oppressed nation? Because we're not following the contract, the brit, the covenant with God. Now the question in a sense ends up being, and Rick, I think you're quite intuitive here, do we have some primordial responsibility for Esau's specific both pain and success, let's say? And we're going to look into that. I think that's actually like, put that in the back burner of your mind. Shosh's pushback was one of the things that I wasn't expecting, I loved hearing it, was, doesn't this end up in a sense diminishing the quality or the significance of what it means to follow the Torah? Because it is in a sense, like it is a Damocles sword hanging over our head. And unless we keep the Torah, we'll get punished, right? Interestingly, Shosh, I think you're actually intuiting something that especially the Kabbalists talk about, that there's two kinds of yira, there's two kinds of fear of God. One kind of fear is called yira ilah, and the other kind of fear is called yira tata, right? There's a lower fear and a higher fear. The lower fear is a fear of punishment, right? It's like, I'm going to get punished if I don't keep the Torah. The higher yira, though, is reverence and awe. It is feeling yourself to be a tiny speck in a huge universe that you can't even comprehend, in the way that you're just struck with what the Germans call mysterium tremendum, right? Just shook to your core. That's like real reverence. That's real awe. Someone scared someone's going to punish you doesn't mean you're really learning. It means you're obedient. You're not transformed by that experience. So will it have the kind of effect that Rick is saying the Torah should be having on us, or is the threat of punishment, of suffering, actually going to keep us from developing? That's a really, I think, really essential questions that people have been trying to work out in exactly these types. I'm so glad you guys like elicited these themes. Incredible. I want to move on a little bit more. So we have actually what ends up being, in a sense, an oppression Olympics between Jacob and Esau. Or Esau says, listen, you fed them tears as their daily bread, right? That's Isaac defending Esau. You fed them tears, you had them drink a third of a gallon of tears. Now, a third, shalish, is relevant because traditionally speaking, at least, Esau cries 3 tears, one from his right eye, one from his left eye, and one in the middle that gets caught in his eyebrow or something like that. The middle tear gets lost. But then we have actually down here, we have Jacob throwing it back, right? We have the Jewish people throwing it back and saying, yeah, he drinks a third of a gallon of tears. My tears have been my bread day and night. All I eat is tears. I am suffering constantly. Don't I really deserve it? Right? We have this jockeying for who deserves God's blessing more, Jacob or Esau, Jews or Christians. And I think, kind of I'll pee what Rick was saying, it's this kind of theology of theodicy of suffering, right? Suffering earns you credit. If you suffer, you deserve more. I think in some funny ways, we're actually seeing that a lot in like social media or like contemporary discourse, that being part of identifying oppression that you've experienced gives you some kind of sense of legitimacy or credit or something like that. And that, I mean, I think that's actually like, there's some real intuition there, some real insight in terms of people's life experience informing the way they think, and having experiences that people in more comfortable positions don't have gives you insights that more comfortable people don't have. That's true. But the flip side of it is that now people think that they need to find oppression, have to suffer in order to have some kind of space on the stage or something like that, or otherwise their words aren't meaningful. So we have this kind of like identification of suffering and meaning that ends up, I think, actually risking some dangerous, let's say, dangerous conditions, let's say at least. You don't want to take on suffering so that people will listen to you, right? So I want to keep on moving to the Zohar, because I want to make sure we get to the mystical stuff. I don't want to keep us too late over 8 o'clock. So the Zohar is the pièce de résistance of classical Kabbalah. It is a unique book. It is one that I don't think is like any other book, honestly, in world religious literature. And I've read it all, folks. I mean, listen, there's a lot of great stuff out there, but the Zohar is really, really special. And it is like the Talmud, but in the sense that it's a bunch of rabbis talking about the Torah, but it's much more experientially attuned. It's much more poetic than the Talmud is. The Talmud's more like dialectical. It's arguing about like points of law. The Zohar is kind of like people riffing on something together, like a mystical jazz, right? Like it's like an improv group, and they're like kind of pinging off of each other and dreaming about the Torah together. So here we have Rebbe Chia from the Zohar, trying to figure out what's going on here with Esau and with Jacob. So he says, Rabbi Chia exclaimed, "How much harm have these tears brought upon Israel, that Esau cried to be blessed by his father, whose words were so dear to him." Here we have, I think, a heightening of an element that was implied perhaps, but now we have the Zohar willing to go there, namely that there is a link between Esau's pain and our experience. That Esau's tears are the reason, in a sense, we are suffering. Esau cried to be blessed by his father. And why? Because his words were so dear to him. Now, not here, but it's already in the Talmud, but we're not looking at that text. But Esau is, according to the Talmud, the biggest daddy's boy, right? Esau is, again, like what we have is this really fascinating refusal by Jewish tradition to ever consign someone to the dark side. Yes, Esau ends up representing our main political and religious rival, Christianity and Rome, right? Fine. But on the other hand, Esau also comes to represent, or is willing to represent, a virtue, namely he respects and honors his father more than anyone else in Jewish history. He is the paragon of respecting your father, and that is a virtue. So Esau, even though he's like the bad guy, still has good in him, and the Talmud and the Zohar is not willing to ignore that just because he ends up serving a different kind of role. So Esau cried out, again, citing the verse, everyone's a rabbi. So we called him Yaakov. Who called him Yaakov? God did. It wasn't really Isaac. It was God doing that. And Esau said this as if spitting in disgust. Why? Because the word Yaakov, we talked before, because Yaakov came out grabbing Esau's heel, and the word for heel in Hebrew is akev. But because the heel is twisted and curved, the word Yaakov also means to deceive. It's not an accident that Yaakov is the trickster of the story. Yaakov tricks his father to get the birthright. Yaakov tricks Lavan, right? Well, he tries to trick him, except that Lavan pulls a fast one on him and ends up tricking him for 28 years. Yaakov is a trickster, kind of like the jackal in Native American or First Nations lore. Right? He's the trickster character, the coyote. Sorry, not the jackal, the coyote. He says God named him Yaakov, and I'm frustrated and furious about that. Why? Because he has supplanted me. He has tricked me these 2 times. The first time with stew, and the second time now with the birthright. He keeps on screwing me over. What are you doing to me, God? Again, what we find here is the Zohar willing to extend, Rebbe Chia willing to extend not just sympathy, but empathy to Esau, empathy to this, again, this like bête noire of our history, that he is hurt, he's hurting, and he feels betrayed, not just by his brother, but by God. And the Zohar has the resilience to be able to express that and to keep on moving further. Rabbi Yesa quoted the verse saying, "A son honors his father and a servant his master." Who's the son? The son refers to Esau, for in the whole history of the world, there has never been a son who respected his father as Esau did. The honor he showed him made him the ruler of the world. Okay, so why is it that Esau / Christendom has top billing in human history at this moment? It's not because we screwed up. It's actually because of something good about him. Esau respected Yitzchak. He was a very dutiful and dignifying son. And because of that, his just deserts is that he deserves something good too. So we have, again, like you could say, oh, sure, Christianity is the religion of this world and we're the religion of the world to come, right? That's the pshara that was made before. But here the Zohar is even willing to say, Esau, Christendom, deserves, I mean, again, like our cousins in Christianity, they deserve some of the good that's coming to them. We don't see them as our enemies. We see them as someone who has worthy traits, and we appreciate that about them. Now, again, like it's not reductive. The Zohar, the Torah, the Talmud, none of this is saying any one thing. What I find most inspiring about this is that the Zohar, the Talmud, and the Torah never, ever, ever reduce any one concept to one idea. It never reduces one person to one idea. People get to stay complex. They get to stay multifaceted. And the Zohar is able to find something of credit in Esau, not just turn him into a villain. Okay. So here we have Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yossi working this out. I think a number of people thought maybe this started at 8. The Parsha class starts at 7. I apologize for everyone joining at 8. Parsha class starts at 7. The Kabbalah class starts at 8. But I'm so happy you joined because we're only really now getting into it. We'll be going for, I'd say, probably at least another 15 minutes. So I'm so happy you're here. Okay. Rabbi Yehuda, another rabbi in the Zohar, picks up this theme. Again, the question of why is it that Esau and Jacob end up having this really painful split as Jacob inherits the double blessing and Esau gets left in the dust, right? Jacob becomes the essence, Esau becomes the second banana, right? So Rabbi, the question I'm asking in this class is, is there something in Jewish tradition that recognizes, in a sense, the cost of what it means to leave someone behind? And I think the answer is yes. Okay. So Rabbi Yehuda says, everything in the world depends on tshuva. Gewalt, right? Everything in the world depends on tshuva. Right? Tshuva changes your life. It changes the world. Tshuva means you rewrite the past based on the present, right? We had a whole month plus of learning about this. And on the prayers people pray to the Holy Blessed One, all the more so if tears are shed in prayer, as there is no gate that tears can't enter. Pause. Okay, we're going to skip to the Talmud for a second, because it's the thing about the Zohar is it's not coming from nowhere. It's coming from the tradition, right? Same voices, same mix and match. So it's drawing on this powerful passage from Maseches Brachos, from the Talmudic tractate about prayer. Don't look at the last text, no spoilers. So Rebbe Elazar says, since the day of the destruction of the temple, the gates of prayer have been locked. And that because to them, right, worship happens in a specific place. What's the place that worship happens in? The temple. And the gates of the temple are closed. Temple's destroyed. Our prayers don't have like an antenna anymore to receive them. As it said, though I plead and call out, he shuts out my prayer. Stark words, right? I plead, I cry, I plead and I pray, but God doesn't hear me. The prayers don't get to God. Very dark image. However, says Rebbe Elazar, even though the gates of prayer are locked, the gates of tears are not. As it is said, Shima tfilati Hashem v'shavati ha'azina el dimati al techarash. Listen to my prayer, God, and pay attention to my pleading. Do not ignore my tears. Prayers, it seems like there's some kind of technical issue, right? You might have like a signal malfunction. Your ISP of prayer might go down. But the thing that always breaks through to God, that no locked door, figuratively speaking, can ever withstand is crying. Crying in breaking something open in you, break something down before God, destroying every obstruction, getting anything out of the way to keep God from attending to us, to keep God from paying attention, to keep us from connecting with God in that way. It's incredible teaching from the Maggid of Mezrich, the student of the Baal Shem Tov. He says, and here he's talking about, in a sense, like the decline. We're talking at the beginning of class before we start recording, we're talking about, is there a Zohar for dummies? Is there a Kabbalah for dummies? The answer is yes. So there's a book out there called Kabbalah for Dummies. And Hasidism, I joked, was like seen as Kabbalah for dummies. Well, here's a good example of that. Part of Kabbalistic prayer was to have all these very complex and Baroque mystical meditations, these formula called the Hearkening, right? That once you have these very specific meditations that you made, thinking about the different aspects of God and different conjugations of God's name, all of it required like 3,000 PhDs in Kabbalah for you to even like try to understand. But the Hasidic movement was like kind of noticing the way in which this was becoming two things. One is that people didn't know how to do it. And the second thing is it became technical, became dry, became lifeless. So the Maggid Mezrich said, in days past, to open the door, every lock had a key. And you needed the right key to open the lock, right? So you need the right mystical meditation to open the gates of prayer. But he says, today, all you need is a broken heart, which is the axe that breaks down every door. The breaking of something inside of you and the release, like the catharsis, the release of tears, the clear manifestation of your grief and sorrow, of your own sense of brokenness coming out. That's something that God cannot ignore. And who is it that the Torah said cried? Esau. The Torah took a verse out. It didn't have to. God didn't have to do that. But God took a verse out of the Torah to specifically say that Esau is the one who cried. And if the rabbis say you don't ignore tears and Esau is the one who cried, it means that God can't ignore Esau. God cannot cast Esau aside, cannot treat him as the bad guy. There needs to be a place in God's heart for Esau, even though he ends up occupying a much more complex and even painful place in ours. Okay, so there's no gate that tears can't enter. What is written? The daughter of Pharaoh, right? So here he's quoting, this is from Zohar on Shmos. He's quoting the Bas Paro, Pharaoh's daughter, sees the ark in the river, in the Nile River, right? And says, oh, who's this child? Opens the ark, sees the kid, and the child is crying, right? Moses, he's crying, and she feels sorry for him. And the Zohar sees the Torah, not just as a history book, but as an autobiography of God. Everything in the Torah is God expressing a different aspect of God's self. So when it says she felt sorry, she opened the ark, who's the she? It's not Basparo anymore. It's the Shekhinah. The Shekhinah is like a mother, it says, hovering over her children, always opening up for their well-being. So just as with crying, we open ourselves up, that's mirrored by the Shekhinah, the mother, like the cosmic mother, opening up in response to someone, again, opening up in tears. This is what I think actually Winnicott, D.W. Winnicott, the psychoanalyst, when he talks about and Melanie Klein as well, when they talk about the good enough mother and the way the mother actually ends up mirroring the child, right? That's actually what the good enough parent does, is that they mirror the child's emotional state, right? Shows them that their feelings are recognized and reflected back at them. It's an essential part of what it means to individuate, to become a self as an infant. So here we have the Shekhinah modeling exactly that dynamic, that the Shekhinah opens up as Moshe opens up in crying. And when he cries, all the evil decrees are shattered, right? It's this catharsis, it's this feeling of just release, of getting rid of everything that's blocking you. And what's written, she felt sorry for him, means the Shekhinah's compassion was awakened and took pity on him. Okay, so we have, I think, what I want to highlight here is that we have this dialogue of feeling. We have the Shekhinah reacting with empathy to the exhibition of pain, of crying, right? And the example, again, we have of crying, we have Moses crying as an infant. He's a baby, fine, babies cry. It's easy to be compassionate for a baby, right? They're small, they're helpless, they can't help themselves. But when a grown, like young adult, Esau, cries, are you able to stay humanizing with him? And the answer is God ignores no one crying. God cannot ignore tears. Something very powerful, actually, powerful theological sentiment. God cannot ignore suffering. Rabbi Yitzchak picks up the theme and says, the redemption of Israel is solely dependent on tears. When the tears of Esau's weeping before his father will cease, as it is written, Esau raised his voice and wept. Okay, so here again, we have the connection between Esau's crying and our state in the world. In a sense, Rabbi Yitzchak is saying, actually, let's continue with Rabbi Yossi and we'll bring them together. Rabbi Yossi said, these tears which Esau wept brought Israel into exile. But when they cease, due to the weeping of Israel, we will finally leave exile, as it is written, with tears they will come and I will guide them with consolation. Okay. So it's incredible. The redemption of Israel, right? Our state, our well-being reflects Esau's. Esau's pain led to our suffering because in some way we're responsible for it. We chapped the bracha, we took the birthright. Esau suffered because of it. Our connection with God is tainted by the means that we took to get there. This is a powerful statement against entitlement. The wrong way to read the Torah, says Rabbi Yitzchak and Rabbi Yossi of the Zohar, is to see it as a continual justification of the Jewish people. We have a special connection with God that justifies this. It justifies the ends justify the means. Push back and say, no, we cannot ignore that the path we took to that connection is complex. It involved collateral damage. And that collateral damage hit us with some emotional shrapnel as well. Our exile was caused because we caused pain to form that connection. Now, there is a way to push it. I think that Shosh was hinting at earlier of like kind of a victim complex, right? Of a martyr complex of like, we're blaming yourself, right? Like, oh, I'm suffering. It must be something I did, and I'm bad because of it. But I don't think that's what the Zohar is getting at. The Zohar is actually trying to say the way that you could see this is as if you ignore the way in which you're responsible. But I'm going to challenge you to be as empathic as possible, to be as compassionate as possible, to be like the Shekhinah, to act like God, and to not ignore the pain that was caused, to turn towards the tears, because no gate can hold them back. And not only that, but how do we bring redemption for ourselves? We mirror Esau like the Shekhinah mirrored the baby. We cry too. The way for us to bring us out of the exile, I think, of our hearts, in a sense, is to cry. But not because of us. I think, and here's where I'm going to push it, although it's not obvious, I think, to the text, but you could say, oh, we cry because we've suffered, right? The suffering, it's if we suffer enough, we'll earn our redemption. But I think it's saying, are we able to enlarge our hearts enough that we can cry for Esau's sake? Can we cry because we witness the suffering that someone's experiencing and share in it with him? And in that way, then, actually end up manifesting the fullest version of ourselves. Okay, so kind of the last text from the Zohar, and then we'll have a little time to talk, and then we'll have a lovely Shabbos, hopefully. So this is the last section in the Zohar on Toldos, and it tells you that when it says Salik Parshas Toldos at the end. But it's a really interesting, like, mic drop moment, that this is the way that this Parsha is ended, to end with this, again, noting the pain, noting the suffering of our enemy. So it says, with Esau, the honor he showed his father caused the Holy Blessed One to extend his rule over the world. And the tears he cried bring his brother Israel under his domain, crying their own tears under his yoke. But when Israel returns to the Holy Blessed One, crying their own tears, as is written, they shall come with weeping. Then liberators will climb Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be God's. Baruch Hashem li'olam, amen v'amen. Okay. There's a couple elements to just highlight before we close the textual portion, and we have a little time for discussion. It says with Esau, right? Why is these are 2 points, right? On one side, there's the success of Esau, right? And on the other side, there is the suffering of Israel, right? And those two dimensions both need explanation because they're related, but they're not the same. The success of Esau is because of his credit, because he respected and honored his father more than anyone else in human history, right? He had a virtuous quality of being a loving and respectful son, and that gained him credit to, in a sense, like gain authority, right? He showed that he's able to relate to people in this kind of generous and magnanimous way, and because of that, then he gained political ascendancy. Again, Esau's identification with Rome and with Christendom, right? Their political success in this world. But the question then is, fine, so let's say Esau does really well, but why are we doing so poorly, right? Like, why don't we both? You know, Esau's got his thing going on. They got his kingdom, and why can't we have our kingdom, right? Why don't we have the same success that Esau has? And the Zohar says, instead of just seeing it as bad luck, or instead of seeing it as entitlement, like screw him, Zohar, I think, is challenging us to be as theologically radical and daring as we can be and say, we're suffering because there is something that we need to take ownership for. We used trickery to get the birthright. Esau's pain is legitimate. Esau hurts for a reason, because Esau was exploited. No, the bracha was expropriated from him, right? It was taken away unfairly and unjustly. So what's the way in which we're going to be able to rectify this? It is only by recognizing the legitimacy of Esau's tears. And we return to God with our own. We'll come weeping, Again, it's one verse, but split into two. They will come with weeping. Sorry, that's two verses. And then, but then liberators will climb Mount Zion to judge the mountain of Esau, and the kingdom will be God's. Now, I think the judgment here isn't like to cast him into hellfire or something like that. I think it's to actually like give him justice. The liberators will come, will be freed in a sense from this like original sin, from our relationship with our sibling, and we'll be able to actually like justify it. We'll be able to say, yes, I recognize, legitimately speaking, lishpot et haresav, right? To bring mishpat, to bring justice to the claim of Esau. That if we recognize the full humanity of everyone involved in the story, that will be liberation. And that, I think, is the challenge that the Zohar lays before us with this parsha. I'm going to stop the screen sharing. Thoughts, challenges, objections, ideas. I can't hear people.
On the surface, it feels like an argument for like decolonization, but except that we're not the dominant colonizers, so it's kind of weird. But I mean, there's sort of like these layers of like recognizing or developing our empathy or guilt, or I guess in a more positive way, tshuva, like recognizing the role that we played and sort of trying to correct it, right? And seeing the injustices that we caused. So yeah.
Yeah, no, it's funny, right? Because like this would make more sense if like we were Esau, right? Like if we were the agents of oppression, and then like, oh, it's the heroism of the oppressor to realize their oppression or what have you. And you know, there is that kind of notion of, but like funny, you know, you're talking about decolonization, like it still centers in a sense the cause of the oppression as the venue in which all of this is happening, right? Like, oh, I need to do tshuva for all the oppression that I've been doing, versus in a sense recentering the question on like the margins, right? Recentering the question on the people who have been oppressed, and actually like asking like, what's your agency in this story? So it is a really interesting like minoritarian literature, as I think Deleuze put it, in the sense of it is a literature written by an oppressed group to take agency, right? Instead of seeing ourselves as subject to Esau's whims or the power of the Christian empire, we instead, in a sense, actually can say, actually, like we're exercising control over our own story, and we're taking responsibility for things that like we could throw up our hands and be like, listen, we're the oppressed people, we have entitlement, you can't hurt us anymore. I think actually there's like some credit, like I think that is a move that people are kind of doing nowadays. But I think the Zohar is saying, no, like the most humanizing element is for you to be as mature and as holistically manifested as possible. Because it is good for everyone's soul to take responsibility for themselves. It is good to learn actually how to own your past mistakes and resist the impulse, I think, to excuse yourself.
Yeah, I guess, I mean, if you think of it in terms of like, so we're the chosen ones, and it's our sort of role to sort of be the light in the world, to be the guide of how we should be living our lives. And if this sort of dominant culture isn't, like if all we ever do is see them as bad and oppressors, sorry, I feel like I'm talking really loud.
No, come you're good.
Then we're not changing anything. But if we are able to sort of see them as equal or empathetic, or like see them differently, then we're spreading more good and light. And
Yeah.
That's a really stupid question.
No.
Why couldn't they share the title? Like why did it have to be one or the other? Why weren't they allowed to? Sorry, it's
not as okay. No such thing. No, I guess there are stupid questions, but there's no such thing as a stupid question when it's asked sincerely, and that is not a stupid question. You're literally repeating the challenge of Esau. Right? Esau is saying, "Listen, like, why couldn't you share it with me?" Right? Like he says, either like, "Don't you have another blessing for me?" Or he's saying, like, "Listen, can't you make room in that blessing for me? I'll take second seat, but like, I'll be second violin. It's okay."
Yeah.
I mean,
is it ever explained why it has to be one or the other? And like,
no, that's the thing. Like Esau's claim stands. Like it doesn't get explained away.
Primogeniture.
Oh, primogeniture. Yeah, well, I mean, in the sense there is a top seat, right? There needs to be some way to organize the next generation, unless you're just going to fall into internecine rivalry, right? Like what we saw with. I mean, what's funny though is yes, technically speaking, the firstborn gets the blessing, right? Gets the double blessing, the double portion. Primogeniture, right? It means that the firstborn gets the primary inheritance. Right, it's a system that existed all the way through the Middle Ages. It's the reason why second and third kids end up becoming priests or going to war, right? Whereas the firstborn gets the title and the nobility. I mean, what's funny though is name a firstborn that it works out for in the Torah. Right? Who are the firstborns? Ishmael, Esau, Reuven, Judah, kind of, right? Of the different mothers. There's never Aharon, right? The leaders in the Torah never end up being the firstborn. Funny enough, right? The challenge against Moshe of Korach and Datan and Aviram is kind of the rebellion of the firstborn, because Datan and Aviram are both from the tribe of Reuven. They're saying, hey, we have firstborn status. Reuven was the firstborn of the tribes. We should be in charge of all the other tribes. And it doesn't work out. Yes, halachically speaking, the firstborn gets the double portion, but in the Agada, right, in the stories in the Torah, it never works. So it's weird. This is what Robert Cover, blessed memory, a Yale law professor, he wrote a book. He wrote an essay, important essay called Nomos and Narrative. And the point of that essay is that law, nomos, right? That's black letter law. It's the way the society works, but it's always qualified, right? It's in some way conditioned by the stories that are used to justify the laws, but also at the same time, the stories also create a more complex picture, because life is more complex than law. So the way in which law gets lived by real people ends up always, in a sense, both justifying the law, but also in some ways adding complexity that makes it clear that the world isn't a book. Right, the world is something much more messy and Cholent-like than that. All right, I think the Torah is really honoring that holy messiness, that holy sacred mess that we call life. And I think again, I think that the takeaway from this that I want to, I mean, again, many takeaways, but a takeaway from this is not that the Zohar is saying that Jacob is bad and Esau is good, and the point is not that it's just broken down in this reductive, simplistic way, but rather that it's living out this model and asking us to live it out too, that the most holistic, most mature way of relating to these stories is to make the most room in your heart as you can to find as many different voices and as many different legitimate positions as you can, because I think actually that ends up being the way that not only Midrash works, but even our halacha ends up showing the best decisions that people make are ones that are able to encompass the most needs and the most perspectives as possible. And through that, you come to wisdom. So may we all find that wisdom this Shabbos and every Shabbos and every week. And God willing, I'll see you Tuesday, the next session, the Kabbalah class. Oh, sorry, Wednesday, 8 o'clock, Kabbalah class. We'll be looking at the transition from Ein Sof into the Sefirot. Very, why can't we just have a mystical God? Why there needs to be a sense of a tangible relational God? That's the question we're going to ask and answer. And then Thursday, a little bit more of a low-key Parsha class, 7 o'clock. I hope to see you there. Havdalah this Saturday night, 5:50, and a little bit of singing and grooving. And God willing, you shall have a great Shabbos.
And Limud Toronto on Sunday.
All right, Limud Toronto on Sunday. Hey, well done. Well done. You know what? I'm doing this. I'm doing this for you. All right, Ben? All right?
Yeah.
All right. All right, guys, have a great Shabbos.
Thank you, Josh.
Thank you.